Welcome to another installment of Castle of the Quest. In these videos I dive deep into the rules and mechanics of original Dungeons & Dragons, discuss approaches to playing solo, and report on how my own solo campaign is progressing. The questing knights have performed their third delve into the Castle of the Quest. This time, they brought in a full party of 9, as well as 2 retainers to guard the front ranks. They entered the dungeon through the secret entrance they discovered on their second delve, a small island in the castle moat with a shaft hidden beneath the dense vegetation, which leads down into the southeastern section of the dungeon. The party bought themselves a raft to cross the moat with, which they are required to carry across land and hide the raft in the island brush for safe retrieval upon exit. In the previous session, the party explored and mapped the first level of the dungeon further. They encountered 3 conjurers coming out of a secret vault. After putting the conjurers and their guards to sleep with a very successful sleep spell, Ilara Nightshade, the party leader, stole a ring of delusion from one of the sleeping conjurers. And this is about where I left off in the last video. So now I'll cover what happened next. And if you recall, I said that these videos will mainly be in a recap/session report format, so I am not constantly repeating examples of the same procedures. I want to cover new ground each time and focus on the most important details, mainly the ones when I get to impart something that sheds some light onto how to implement OD&D rules and my thoughts and approaches to solo gaming mechanics, etc, etc. So, the party step over the sleeping bodies and they enter the vault, which is being held open by the sleeping conjurers and their guard. Inside, they find a dead chimera and 60 gold pieces. How did this come about? So basically, I rolled to randomly determine the contents of the room in accordance with the tables in Gary Gygax's Solo Dungeon Adventures, which, if you have been watching this video series closely, you'll know was published in Strategic Review magazine issue number 1 in the spring of 1975. My version is slightly customised, as I've discussed in previous videos also. When rolling to determine what was in the vault, I rolled monster and treasure, and of course I ended up with a chimera. If you know the monster determination tables in D&D Book 3, you might notice that on dungeon level 1, a chimera shouldn't turn up, because it's on monster table 6. And dungeon level 1 can only have monsters up to table 4. Very true, but I made a mistake. I rolled a 6 on my d6 and read table 6 instead of table 4 by mistake. I didn't catch this little error at the time, but when these things happen, they can ultimately become part of the story canon. I just roll with it, unless it is game breaking. Regardless though, whether it was a chimera or a group of myrmidons, I decided that as the conjurers had clearly been through this room, it made sense that the monster guarding it was dead, slain by their hands with either spells or brawn, or both. They missed the 60 gold pieces though, and a big pile of silver, but the party went for the gold instead, and left the silver to keep their encumbrance manageable. After retrieving the gold, the party split up and checked every inch of the room for secret doors. They found one on the west wall, and beyond they crept along a southeastern passage and into a crypt. The air here was still and smelled dank and mouldy. Inside the crypt were 8 skeletons, at a 40-foot distance. And fortunately, no surprise on the party. This was a tough fight which lasted for 9 rounds, in which both the party's heavy-foot retainers were slain. The clerics were also slain. This included Sister Atra, Brother Hugh and Brother Holger. All 3 of these clerics, as one might expect, attempted to turn the skeletons. And this leads us naturally to an interesting topic of discussion. How does Turn Undead work in original Dungeons & Dragons? Let's take a look. In the 3 brown books of OD&D, there is actually no explicit reference to Turn Undead. The term came along a little later. In Men and Magic, there is the Clerics vs Undead Monsters table. How this table should be used is not fully explained. The book simply tells us that 2 6-sided dice are rolled, and the score required by the level of the cleric versus the corresponding undead monster must be matched or exceeded. A T indicates that the creature is automatically turned away, and 2 dice rolled to see how many are turned away. A D indicates the creature is actually destroyed by being either dispelled or dissolved, and 2 dice are rolled to see how many are destroyed or dissolved. An N indicates that the creature cannot be turned. The rules also explain that evil clerics do not have the ability to turn undead whatsoever. The entire effect is lost if a cleric is or becomes evil. So we have a basic understanding of this mechanic, but some obvious questions arise. Where in the combat turn sequence does this ability take effect? If a number is given and not a letter, does this mean only a single creature can be turned? Is this spell limited in the sense that it can only be used a limited amount of times? I'll try and answer these questions. Firstly, regarding where in the turn sequence the ability should be placed, the placement of the table in the book offers some indication. It appears under the spells table for clerics before the full spell explanations are provided, so common sense would suggest that this ability should be treated much like a spell. So as per my last video where I discussed how spell casting fits into the turn sequence, we might say that a cleric's attempt to turn the undead away begins in the movement phase, and this attempt, if successful, takes effect just prior to the melee phase. In regards to how many creatures are turned when a T or D is not indicated, if we look to Eric Holmes' Basic Dungeons and Dragons rules, which is essentially a version of the original D&D rules edited by Eric Holmes, disregarding anything applicable to higher levels of play, Holmes does provide some further information for turning undead. His edit states that when a number is indicated, then roll 2 6-sided dice. If the roll is equal to or greater than the number given in the table, it means the cleric has been successful in turning the undead, and a second die roll can be used to determine how many have been affected. Notice he uses the term die and not dice, which implies a 1d6 roll. But the question still remains, does this line up with how Gary Gygax saw it? The AD&D Player's Handbook states the cleric must be in a position to step before the undead, and he or she must have time to speak and hold forth the religious symbol in order to turn or command undead, and this, of course, precludes other spell activity. But it is the Dungeon Master's Guide which provides a detailed explanation, It clarifies the limitations of this ability. It says that clerics can attempt to perform this ability once during the combat. However, if multiple types of undead are present, then the cleric must attempt to turn them in the order presented on the table. If the cleric is successful in turning any of a single type, then on the next round the cleric can attempt to turn creatures of the next type. At least this is my understanding of a very obscurely written paragraph. Despite the heavy casualties, the party did manage to defeat the skeletons, who were guarding a further 40 gold pieces of treasure, bringing a grand total for this very short-lived adventure to 100 gold pieces. The party only lasted until turn 8, so spent less than 1 hour and 30 minutes in the underworld before they were forced to retreat once again. This brings us to the bookkeeping necessary between OD&D adventures. The party began the expedition on the 27th of September, and dungeon expeditions require a week of game time. This brings the campaign date to the 4th of October, and support and upkeep was due at the end of the month, so the party cough up the 16 gold pieces due. The total experience points from the monsters defeated was 145, and with the extra 100 from the treasure, the grand total is 245. This is a 40 XP share each for the surviving characters, which is then computed regarding their XP bonuses. Now, OD&D Men and Magic says experience points are awarded to players by the referee with appropriate bonuses or penalties for prime requisite scores. As characters meet monsters in Mortal Kombat and defeat them, and when they obtain various forms of treasure, money, gems, jewellery, magical items, etc., they gain experience. This adds to their experience point total, gradually moving them upwards through the levels. Regarding experience for magical items, no guidance is provided. Elara acquired the Ring of Delusion, so she may be due experience for this, and there is also perhaps the option to sell this item if she has no use for it. The obvious place to look for guidance when it's lacking is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which I did, and I quickly ruled, based on the values given in the Dungeon Master's Guide, that the Ring of Delusion grants no experience points and sells for no more than 2,000 gold. I settled on this for the sake of progress and moved on. But was this the wrong call? Are the economies of these two systems that similar? It's the same author, albeit with the intention of moving away from co-creator Dave Arneson. But there is a clear intention of making the system more robust, more consistent, with parameters inflicted to create games that can span campaigns across the world. I ended up going down a serious rabbit hole with this particular curiosity, and the short answer is no. The economic systems of the two games have some distinct differences. The precious metal exchange rate is different, but only in a minor way. But a major difference is that in AD&D, treasure distribution should be very much handled by the referee, and in OD&D, the procedures suggested are a little more defined. However, if looking at Appendix A in the DMG, random treasure rolled for rooms that contain monsters with treasure, this appendix provides a heck of a lot more treasure than the table in OD&D Book 3. I really don't think we can presume that the XP values and sale prices attached to the magic items in AD&D can economically translate back to OD&D. All we are really left with regarding the value of magic items in OD&D are the examples of costs in Men and Magic for making magic items. So I scrutinised this to see if I could shed some light on the subject. At first glance, it seemed like a very incomplete list, and it may be the case that it still is. I was at a loss for ages, but I had a slight epiphany eventually. If you look at the items Gary has chosen to give examples of, you might break them down into the following categories. Scrolls, potions that create the effects of a spell, potions that create special abilities. Enchanted arrows, enchanted armour without special abilities, wands, rings that create special abilities. To support this categorisation, if you read Gary's FAQ article in Strategic Review number 2, he breaks down how XP should be awarded for magical items, and he uses very similar examples. He says, thus, in the Greyhawk campaign, a magic arrow +1 is worth a maximum of 100 points experience. A +1 magic sword with no special abilities is valued at a maximum of 1000 points. A scroll of spells at either 500 or at 100 points per level per spell. So a 6th level spell is worth a maximum of 600 experience points. A potion is worth between 250 and 500 points. And even a genie ring is worth no more than about 5,000 points maximum. Keeping the potential categorisations in mind, this roughly translates to scrolls equals 100 XP per spell level. Potions that create the effects of a spell equals 250 XP. Potions that create special abilities equals 500 XP. Enchanted arrows equals 100 XP per arrow. Enchanted weapons without special abilities equals 1000 XP. Rings that create special abilities equals 5000 XP. Making comparisons between the two categorisations, we might deduce a more realised list of magic item categories, which could be used as a guide for assigning costs and XP value. And following this through, we might end with a fuller list of costings and XP values. This is more or less about spotting patterns and making deductions on that basis. For example, a potion that creates a special ability costs 4 times more to make than a potion that creates a spell effect. I used the same ratio on rings and armour or weapons. 4 times the cost, double the XP. Wands are 10 times less valuable than rings with special abilities, so I calculated the XP value for wands on that basis. Drilling down, I ended up with a list of manufacturing costs and XP values that covers all the magic items available. This is by no means a final determination, but it's a step closer to clarifying a part of the original game which has been ambiguous for so long. But we still have not arrived at a good determination for selling prices. I think to protect the game economy, sale price could equal XP value. So if a player gets lucky on a delve and gets a magic item through random treasure tables at level 1 and wishes to sell it, Ilara's Ring of Delusion is a fine example. She would get maybe 5,000 gold for it at best, but not 50,000. Using XP and not manufacturing cost therefore protects the rate of level advancement for characters, which is of course desirable. Let's move on. I may need to revisit this topic later, but the game calls. On the 5th of October came the new recruits. I lost 3 of my 9 characters, so I rolled up 3 more. No significant ability scores came up. An elf with a 16 charisma called Bree Landell Golden Dawn, or Bree for short, and a magic user with a 15 intelligence called Gwen Stormcrow. The whole party are kitted out with a light horse and saddlebags. The party also invested in some other luxuries: a vial of holy water each, plenty of oil, some silver arrows, and so on. The plan is to explore the area local to the starting town known as the Last Redoubt, and the nearby dungeon at the Castle of the Quest. They wish to secure knowledge of the lay of the land, so they will circle around the Last Redoubt and spread further out until they discover something of interest. This is the campaign's first wilderness adventure. Before they ventured out, Ilara used the money from the sale of the Ring of Delusion to fund a recruitment campaign for a group of knights-at-arms on heavy horse to protect the party out in the wilderness. Bree will do the hiring with a budget of 1,900 gold, a nice amount granted by the sale of Ilara's Ring of Delusion. On this occasion, the party hire servitors to send messages throughout the land. The cost will be 400 gold for this, and its effectiveness is 30%. The party desire 6 heavy horse for a month's service. The minimum down payment will be 100 gold per recruit, and there will be an additional offer of a 5% treasure share for each retainer hired, to increase the chance of receiving applicants. If you watched my previous video for session 5 of this campaign, I provided details of how I handle recruitment campaigns. The time required for this campaign is 4 days. The campaign reached 12 candidates and 4 applied, but after formal offers were made, only 3 accepted the positions, and they started their employment with average loyalty scores and no bonuses to morale. The campaign itself cost 700 gold of the 1,900 budget, and the party decide to take what they have and carry out their next quest. The campaign date is now the 9th of October, and it is time for the questing knights to venture forth into the wilderness of Pylea. To handle a solo wilderness adventure, I have pulled together all the rules for wilderness exploration outlined in the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures book. I've had to reference certain rules in Outdoor Survival to fill in some of the more ambiguous or empty spaces, and I put together a wilderness turn tracker to help keep the procedure uniform. I also needed something to handle procedural generation of the wilderness, so I looked to Appendix B of the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide, but I adapted it to only cover the terrain types mentioned in the OD&D books. You might be wondering why I'm not using the Outdoor Survival map. A few reasons. Firstly, I don't want to know the lay of the land, and secondly, the rules advise the use of what they call the referee's map in an ongoing campaign. Gary says, referee's map is a wilderness map unknown to the players. It should be for the territory around the dungeon location. When players venture into this area, they should have a blank hexagon map, and as they move over each hex, the referee will inform them as to what kind of terrain is in that hex. This form of exploring will eventually enable players to know the lay of the land in their immediate area, and thus be able to select a site upon which to build their castles. Exploratory adventures are likely to be the most exciting, and their incorporation into the campaign is most desirable. Regarding outdoor survival, the wilderness rules say off-hand adventures in the wilderness are made on the outdoor survival playing board. But it then says exploratory journeys such as expeditions to find land suitable for a castle or in search of some legendary treasure are handled in an entirely different manner. Additionally, in Europa magazine in 1975, Gary wrote some simple steps to follow when setting up a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. One of the steps requires sitting down with a large piece of hex rule paper and drawing a large-scale map, A map with a scale of 1 hex equals 1 mile will allow your imagination to devise some interesting terrain and places, and it will be about right for player operations such as exploring, camping, adventuring, and eventually building their strongholds. Even such small things as a witch's hut and side entrances to the dungeon can be shown on the map. The central features of the map must be the major town and the dungeon entrance. There's no reason why you couldn't use the outdoor survival map, or any other map board from another game, such as Barbarian Prince. Daniel from Bandit's Keep uses the outdoor survival playing board in his solo OD&D game, and in Men and Magic under Scope it tells us the use of map boards is standard. To help me lock in the wilderness travel procedure, I created a simple wilderness turn tracker. This also helps me capture the events of the adventure for recap later. Movement rates in OD&D are given as number of hexes per day with a presumed scale of 5 miles per hex. The text then goes on to say that terrain penalties are as in outdoor survival. For flexibility and clarity, you really want to convert these numbers into miles per day. That way, the terrain penalties are easier to compute, and you can change the map scale. For example, a character on foot can move 3 hexes per day on a 5 mile per hex map, therefore they move 15 miles per day. This is their movement rate. For 1 mile hexes, they would be able to move 15 hexes. Mountains and swamps cost 3 movement per hex, which at standard 5 mile scale is 1/3 the movement rate. Woods and desert cost 2 movement, so 2/3 movement rate. And apart from the threat of wandering monsters, the chance of becoming lost, and the requirement for resting a full day after 6 days of movement, I'm sure the clerics might especially want to honour that. There are no mechanics for any further challenges like tracking water or food, but the game suggests some requirement to consider these things by including rations and water or wineskins in the standard equipment. So I decided to include a water index and food index in my wilderness turn tracker, very much like the one we see in outdoor survival. This would appear to be the obvious choice for a referee's consideration, especially if the referee purchased the outdoor survival game to help them run their D&D campaign. So the party will start their wilderness adventure with a life level of 15. The party will lose a life level on their 3rd, 5th, 6th and 7th day without water. The party will lose a life level on their 5th, 9th, 12th, 15th, 18th, 20th, 22nd, 23rd and 24th day without food. As their life level decreases, so does their movement rate. I matched the ratio of decline in movement rate with the outdoor survival rules and attached attack and armour class penalties, so as movement rate falls, so does fighting capability. These new mechanics naturally led me to include others from outdoor survival regarding finding food. If rations have been exhausted, or perhaps they have spoiled, you can satisfy the current day's need for food by rolling a 1 or 2 after ending the current day's movement. You may recover 3 steps on the food index by remaining stationary for 3 turns. Regarding water, if water or perhaps wine is expended, you can satisfy the current day's needs for water if you pass through or end your movement on a water hex. You may also recover 1 step on the water index by remaining stationary for the following 3 turns on a water hex. There is plenty of mystery that surrounds the use of water skins, as the original rules are silent on this matter. We know that wine is provided in quarts at 1 gold per quart. According to Britannica, the quart was originally a medieval English unit for dry and liquid measures that varied between 0.95 and 1.16 litres, relatively close to its modern equivalents. I'd be tempted to calculate what a person needs per day to survive in the wilderness, but this is subject to so many factors such as level of activity, temperature, size of the person, and so on. Curiously, if we look at weights and equivalents in Men and Magic, it says a water or wineskin is 30 encumbrance, and a flagon is 50. A flagon holds about 1.1 litres of fluid. So this might indicate a skin holds less, but not really because it depends on the weight of the material, and encumbrance is an abstraction. But in abstract terms, we might say that a full skin of water or wine would probably not hold more than a litre or thereabouts, which is more or less 1 quart. If it did hold less, then it would not make much sense buying wine in quarts. And if it held more, then I think it would probably have a higher encumbrance than the flagon. So logic tells me that the water or wineskin holds up to 1 quart of fluid in OD&D. In Europa magazine, Gary Gygax wrote an article about first adventures in a dungeon, and he says, "We have pretty much settled upon the following as standard equipment: dagger, 50 feet of rope, a 10-foot pole, 12 iron spikes, a small sack, a leather backpack, water/wineskin, lantern, 3 flasks of oil, holy water, a quart of wine, and iron rations." But why wine? The most logical answer is an alternative to contaminated drinking water. But just 1 quart and a whole week worth of iron rations. On the surface, this doesn't appear to make much sense. But think about what the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures rulebook tells us about time in the campaign world. It tells us that a dungeon expedition lasts 1 week, and it also tells us that the time for dungeon adventures considers only preparations and a typical 1-day descent into the pits. Think about the implications of this. 1-day descent into the pits, where I can bet drinking water is not a guarantee. A day's worth of wine would seem an obvious standard. Out in the wilderness though, water needs for several weeks at a time might be needed, and could be sourced as needed from non-contaminated water sources, such as mountain rivers, freshwater lakes and the like. There's the option to simply presume they are met as required, or optionally, as I'm doing, the outdoor survival rules could be utilised to add the extra challenge to the game. So with all these mechanics in mind, the questing knights begin to explore Pylea on the 9th of October. Their movement rate will be 30 miles per day at the speed of the heavy horses. At the start of the day, after the terrain has been determined, a check to see if the party is lost is made. They are not. The terrain surrounding the last redoubt is woodlands, and the party explore 9 miles of it, until they happen upon a small dwelling. Part of Gary Gygax's solo wilderness rules is a check in each space for the possibility of inhabitation. There is a 16% chance. These inhabitants I presume to be predominantly human, as demi-human settlements of both elves and dwarves are handled in a different way through the percent chance in lair mechanic. Halflings are an exception to this, so there should be a chance of halfling inhabitation. Now, when I first examined these mechanics and tried to draw some conclusions, I decided to roll on the Wilderness Wandering Monsters table, under the city category, and I ended up rolling zombies. So that's how this will play out on this occasion. There's nothing necessarily incorrect about this approach. Deciding what dwells where is really an exercise which is at the discretion of the referee, but I felt it was important to consider that the procedural generation of these settlements, as discussed, came from OD&D, where there is no further tables to define the exact details of what an inhabitation is. The Dungeon Master's Guide does offer some insight, which can help figure out the intention of the author regarding these random settlements. He says, "The bulk of the people met on an adventure in an inhabited area, whether city, town, village, or along the roads through the countryside, will be average folk with no profession as adventurers know it, and no special abilities for clericism, fighting, magic, or thievery. They are simply typical normal people, as you define typical and normal for the milieu, of course. Typical, if we look at it from an OD&D context, is clearly non-fantastic human types, and as I said, exotic inhabitations such as demi-human ones would be handled under the percent chance in lair mechanic. Of course, this is all down to personal taste, and in my campaign I'm trying to cultivate what I believe to be the implied setting of the original game, so I am being quite critical about every decision I make and trying to get a good understanding of how Gary thought about these things, hence diving often into what AD&D has to say on certain subjects. But I try to be careful about the context of the writing and how the two products differ. But as the roll was made on this occasion on the Wilderness Wandering Monsters table under the entry for city, in this session we ended up with a small dwelling inhabited by zombies, so let's see where this might lead. I figured a really good spot for an encounter with zombies in the context of a single dwelling would be a mausoleum. I looked at some floor plans for mausoleums, chose one that inspired me and drew it up on graph paper. This is how the encounter played out. The party dismount to enter the mausoleum. As they force open the heavy door to the mausoleum, the smell of decay engulfs them, and they are immediately set upon by 5 zombies, who surprise them, and melee ensues. Now, as I've touched on before, if we look at the rules that span OD&D and Chainmail, then there are several systems to consider when resolving melee. There is the 120 scale, the man-to-man system, fantasy combat, and the alternative combat system. To better define these for OD&D, we could say 120 melee is troop versus troop. The man-to-man system is weapon versus armour. The alternative combat system is fighting ability versus armour class. And under OD&D, fantasy combat is fought as fighting ability versus armour class, but only with just one exchange of blows per round. So, which situations call for which approach? Looking at fighting ability versus armour class, this is the alternative combat system, which uses the combat matrices in Men and Magic, as per the advice in Strategic Review Issue 2. This method is suggested for handling small melees involving principal figures or stronger monsters. Weapon versus armour, which utilises the man-to-man combat table in Chainmail, is suggested for handling small melees involving less important humanoid figures of 1 hit die or less, excluding undead, nixies or pixies. Troop type versus troop type is suggested for handling large melees involving mainly figures of 1 hit die or less. We know that this is designed for 120 scale, but it works at smaller scales too, with perhaps 5 or more figures per side in melee range, and the formation is treated as a single unit with a scale anywhere from 1 figure equals 1 combatant or higher up to 120 scale. This approach is perfect for situations where you don't want to focus on a blow-for-blow situation. I've chosen this approach for this melee. My first reason is for experimental purposes, and my second is a melee of 12 versus 5 low-level creatures where every blow is considered will not likely make an exciting battle. So let's see how it plays out. The zombies attack as Heavyfoot and defend as Lightfoot, and need never check morale, but will instead fight to the death. The front rank defenders in the party defend as Heavyfoot, so the zombies need 6s to kill, and get 1 die per figure. They manage to score 1 kill, as the party are surprised they cannot deliver any casualties in return. On the second round of melee, Viridis and Cydric, who are unopposed, can move into rear attack positions. Bart will move into the front rank so he can stand before the zombies and attempt to turn them. He fails to do so. The zombies can only attack the front-facing troops. They do so and score 2 kills. The party get 2 Heavyfoot attacks against the zombies, 1 die per figure, 5s or 6s to kill, 1 kill. They also get 2 rear attacks. These figures get to attack at the next highest level, so this will be 2 armoured foot versus 2 lightfoot, so a 4 to 6 kills. They score 1 kill. On the third round, Abra, Maud and Gwen move into flanking positions. The zombies get 3 dice against Bart, looking for a 6 to kill. No kills. They also get 3 dice against the flankers, who will defend at the next highest level. Lightfoot becomes Heavyfoot, so 6 to kill. They manage to slay Gwen. Party get 1 normal attack, 3 flank attacks and 2 rear attacks, and score 2 kills. On the fourth round, the last zombie is very easily surrounded and slain. So we have this situation where we have a mausoleum in the forest of Evilshaw. The threat has been taken care of, and it feels like there should be something here to discover. This scenario might never have come about if not for colouring outside the lines of OD&D a little in terms of how the scenario was generated. But it's here now. The pencil is on the paper, so the work will be treated as canonical. However, in regards to what deeper mysteries might be present within the mausoleum, I want to ensure that we are integral to game balance and the implied setting. As far as the 3 LBBs are concerned, arbitrary distribution of treasure is specific to the underworld, and the only consideration for treasure in the wilderness is when a monster encounter takes place in the monster's lair. Zombies, in accordance with the monster list, are not associated with either a lair or a treasure type. However, their description in Monsters and Magic does mention a possibility of them being situated to guard some item at the referee's option. So taking this and running with it, I came up with some simple mechanics to generate some kind of feature for the party to interact with. I also decided to add a little solo play mechanic when zombies are encountered to determine whether anything is being guarded. I took the table in OD&D Book 3 under Distribution of Monsters and Treasure and adapted it so that instead of the treasure being determined by the level of the dungeon, it will be determined by the number of zombies present and the size of the party, but works much the same way. The higher the level of the challenge, the more likely a large amount of gold, silver, jewellery, gems or magical items will be guarded. In regards to creating random features to a location found out in the wilderness, I found something quite useful for doing this in the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide Appendix H, which has a useful list of features and attributes for creating ideas for special random tricks or traps. So I decided that when something a little more special or unique is desired, instead of one of the usual random traps included in the random dungeon generator, or a situation arises where the party have discovered a special feature, such as a long-forgotten ruin in the wilderness, and this feature is lacking any interesting discovery for the party to make, the results, once interpreted, can lead to undiscovered areas in the underworld, or conceal many useful and magical items. I basically took the original list and reworked it into random tables perfect for randomly adding features of interest when the party stumble across something out of the ordinary. I added ideas for tricks and traps presented in OD&D Book 3 and Greyhawk to flesh it out, make it more suitable for OD&D, and round the number of entries into the tables so suitable die rolls can be made. In this case, it is a D44 for the features and a D66 for the attributes. For D44, one D4 is for the tens and the other is for the units, and the results will be a number between 11 and 44. D66 works very much the same, but generates a number between 11 and 66. The cool thing about these tables are that the combinations are virtually endless, and they can also specifically produce the tricks given as examples in both OD&D Book 2 and Greyhawk. The basic idea is that a feature is rolled, and an attribute, and then some rationale is applied to interpret the results into a trick or trap. For simplicity and consistency in a solo game, the chances for a character to fall for one of these tricks or traps are 2 in 6, with a roll made for every character who might be affected. Any characters who fail must then make the appropriate saving throw, or be subject to the effects of the trick or trap. The nature and effects of the trick or trap should always be decided prior to determining whether any character is subject to its effects. In the current scenario, I rolled food and suggests, so I decided that a large table in the centre of the mausoleum is spread with a delicious feast. The food never spoils and never runs out. However, if any is taken, and some magic is enforced to tempt nearby humanoids to do so, a saving throw versus spells must be made, or the feaster will feel compelled to climb into one of the sarcophagi and await death from starvation and thirst. Once deceased, the victim will return as a zombie, ready to heed the command of some unknown magic user or evil cleric. Uncompelled characters can attempt to stop the compelled ones by successfully grappling them for 2 rounds. Cedric, Alara, Abra, and Ella are all affected by the magic, and they all fail their saving throw versus spells, so all 3 are compelled towards the sarcophagi at the north end of the mausoleum. Viridis, Bart, Maud, and Bree attempt to grapple them for 2 rounds, and unfortunately, only Alara is subdued, so Ella, Abra, and Cedric are all lost to the calling of the grave. The party cut their losses and go home, and as far as what the zombies were guarding goes, they found a small cache of 200 silver pieces and 20 gold pieces. Perhaps the place has already been plundered by a previous adventuring party. Perhaps the zombies that were destroyed on this occasion were members of this previous party. The unfortunate ones who did not make it out alive. The party returned to the last redoubt on foot, as they will need to lead the spare horses, but they are just able to make it back before the day ends.